I want to talk to you about half-square triangles. Half-square triangles are very common in a lot of the different designs that you'll see in quilting. So I want to show you a few different ways to get them. For this technique, I've cut these squares 2 7/8 inches, which is the size that I need for a 2-inch finished half-square triangle. I'm going to take those squares and cut them on the diagonal. Now those pieces are going to be sewed together using my scant 1/4-inch seam allowance. With this technique, you need to be certain that you use a leader. The pointy ends of those half-square triangles that you've pre-cut can have a tendency to actually be taken down into the base of your machine. The only way I know of to prevent that from happening is to actually use the leader when you're sewing. We'll sew a couple together here. Cut them apart, and then we're going to press them. Setting the seam first, and in this case I'm going to press them to the darkest fabric. So now that half-square triangle should measure 2 1/2 inches at this point. All right, pretty good. When it's sewed into the block, it'll actually measure 2-inch finish. That's why we call it a 2-inch finished half-square triangle. This technique I like to use because when you pre-cut the half-square triangle pieces, the other method, you have to actually sew on the bias edge, and that can be really stretchy. And then I also talked about the points going down into your machine. With this technique, it's going to avoid the stretch of the bias, and there isn't going to be anything to be pointy to go down into your machine. I like to take my fabric and pre-size it, so I'll use my best press and I'll spray size them so that they're a little bit stiffer, makes it easier to handle it. And I will actually cut it 1/8 of an inch bigger. So if I want a 2-inch finished half-square triangle, I'm going to cut my square 3 inches after I've pressed them. Now I'm going to take and draw a line across the diagonal of that block. Now, if you have a machine like mine where I can move the needle to be a scant 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the foot, all you need is that center line. But if your machine can't do that, you need to actually draw the scant 1/4 inch. So the scant 1/4 inch is again going to be just 1 needle width away from the actual 1/4 inch, from the actual center line. Then I'll turn it over and draw it on the other side because we're going to actually sew this square twice. Now I go to my machine and I'm going to sew on those 2 outside lines, not on the center line, on the outside lines. Flip it around and come to the other side. Now when I'm doing a quilt, I'll easily run 10 to 15 of these through at the same time and actually chain piece as I go. Now we actually cut down the center line. The seam is already sewed, so I've lost the risk of the block actually stretching it as I go. When I take it now to the ironing board, set my seam, pressing in this case to the dark side of the fabric, my block actually will measure larger than I want it to be. This block is now measuring 2 5/8 inches. The reason I like this next technique is I know that my half-square triangle block will measure exactly 4 1/2 inches, so that when I sew my block together, I'm not having to fudge my seams and ease things in. The block is all going to fit together beautifully because I've trimmed it all down. To trim the block, you need to use a square ruler that actually has a diagonal line that runs up the very center of the ruler, ending at the very point. You always want to square up using the 1-1 edge of the ruler on the top right-hand line. Line that diagonal line up onto the seam itself. Now cut the right and the top. Now spin the block around. Now measure it exactly at 2 1/2 inches. and trim it down. So now my block measures exactly 2.5 inches, and I don't have any of those funny things that we call dog ears sticking out onto the block. It's a perfect 2.5 inch block. I like to use this technique of half square triangles when I need to make a lot of half square triangles that are all the same color for any particular quilt or a block. With this technique, you're going to take your 2 pieces of fabric and you're going to cut them larger than you need them to be, and then using your Mary Ellen's best press, you want to stiffen them up so that they're actually going to keep their shape when you're doing the sewing. You're going to use a product called Triangles on a Roll. Triangles on a Roll has been around for a long time, and they do triangles of just about any size you possibly can imagine or need for any quilt. So for this one, I've chosen the 2-inch finished half square triangles. We're going to take those 2 pieces of fabric that have been stiffened up with our Mary Ellen's best press, and we're going to pin the paper to the fabric. This is going to hold it in place. And what you'll notice is that the paper itself actually tells you exactly where to sew. You're going to sew on the dotted line and follow it all the way around, doing a continuous line over the block. It's kind of fun because as you're going, you're trying to make a continuous line so that you don't have to stop and start as you go. And you go all the way around this. When you get to the end, you'd actually go to the other side of the cut line. So I've already done this on this piece. So on this, I've sewed on the dotted line all the way around on both sides of the cut line. Now I'm going to go to my rotary cutter, and I'm going to cut it out on the cut lines of the paper. And if you do it right, which sometimes happens and sometimes doesn't, you can actually cut them all out at once without having to cut them into individual pieces. I'm going to spin my mat around. Now I'm going to cut all 3 of these at the same time. Here, one more long cut, and then I'm going to start the diagonal cuts. Diagonal cut here. Slide my ruler. That seems to keep the half square triangles from moving out of place. And now to here. Now I've got 12 half square triangles. Now, although I like this technique because it doesn't require any math, it doesn't require any extra effort, the one thing I don't like is that the next step is taking off the paper. So if you take your time with it, don't try to rush it, you'll get those papers off in no time, and then you'll have an awful lot of half square triangles to do your next block with. The one thing you will have to do is after you've done the pressing, you will have to trim off the dog ears that are left behind. The final technique that I'm going to show you for making half square triangles is actually my favorite technique. It accomplishes a lot of half square triangles in a limited amount of time, and they're very, very precise. So I'm going to again take my 2 pieces of fabric, and I'm going to use the Mary Ellen's best press and stiffen them up so that they'll be easier to control. Now, instead of putting the paper on, I'm actually going to draw the squares instead. So I'm going to start always about a 1/2 inch from the edge of the fabric. And now I'm going to measure in 2 7/8 inches. I can do this 2 7/8 inches, not have to do the 3 inch, because I'm making so many at a time that it's actually going to still come out very, very accurate. After I've done it twice, my 2 7/8 inch lines here, now I'm going to spin it and start making them into squares. Again, trying to stay about a 1/2 inch from the edge of the fabric so that I have room to sew and turn. Two 2 7/8 again. And one last time on this size. Now I'm going to draw the diagonals going across. I've found through doing this a million times that if I start on the bottom right-hand square drawing my diagonal, I'm actually able to get a more continuous line than if I start anywhere else. I don't know why, it just works out that way. Now what this technique is not going to have is it's not going to have the sewing line. So for this technique, you need to be able to move your needle the scant quarter inch away from the edge of the foot. If you don't have a needle that you can move, a machine where you can move the needle to that scant quarter inch position that you've tested, then you're going to actually have to draw all 3 of the lines, and that's just kind of tedious. So this really works best if you have the ability to move your needle to the right or to the left. Now I'm going to come and sew on either side of this line all the way around. You can see that I've actually sewed the scant quarter inch along both sides of the line that I draw. Now I'm going to take this to the ironing board and press it. Now I'm going to cut it on the cut lines. And I'll just cut on the drawn lines that I made, very much like I did when I had the paper method. And then cut all my diagonals. What I like best about this technique is now I don't have to take the paper off. I would just do the pressing, and these would be perfect 2.5 inch, so that when I finished, I'd have 2.5 inch finished half square triangles.